While Elijah and his younger brother Denny were constantly on the run dodging debts, Denny was busy dating online using Elijah's photos. Denny bragged that his new catch was wealthy, ridiculously handsome, and just a little on the older side. Elijah took one look at the guy's picture and fell into a dead silence. The good news: the man was in fact absolutely gorgeous. The bad news? It was his powerful, inescapable ex-boyfriend, the very man Elijah had dumped a year ago. Main text. Elijah stared dead at the cold, striking face on his phone screen. His fingertips trembled uncontrollably, making the soft glow around the phone's edge quiver. Say that again? How did you two meet? Sunlight spilled through the dusty windows of their cramped apartment, casting warm but mottled patches of light. His younger brother, Denny, sank deep into the battered sofa, tossing the last piece of premium chocolate into his mouth. His cheeks bulged as he chewed. We met gaming. He sucks at it, but Hez loaded. At those words, the rigid tension in Elijah's back instantly vanished. The sunlight caught his hair, painting a soft, warm, golden halo over him. Brent never played video games. There was a massive 9-year gap between them, and the man always sat high up in the clouds, carrying the effortless grace of a mature man who despised childish pastimes. It seemed this was just a pathetic scammer using stolen photos. You didn't get scammed out of your money, did you? Elijah raised an eyebrow, letting out a long breath. No way. Denny leaped up, beaming proudly in the warm light. He spent it all on me willingly. He gave me $100,000. Elijah's eye roll froze halfway. He snatched the phone, his gaze nailed to that long string of zeros. Before he could even process the absurd number, the screen abruptly cut to black. An incoming video call flashed frantically, casting a blinding, erratic light across his pale face. The two of them stood there like they'd been cursed, neither daring to move a muscle until the ringing finally died in the silence. Just as Elijah swallowed hard, 2 lines of text popped up on the screen. Answer it, or pay me back. $130,000. 130? I knew it. Just a con artist trying to extort us. Elijah hurled the phone onto the sofa, his chest heaving. Denny nervously intertwined his fingers, his eyes darting away. Remember that time Mom's breakfast stand got smashed up and I won $30,000 from that lottery ticket? The cozy afternoon sunlight seemed to freeze in an instant. Elijah's pupils shrank drastically. His gaze swept over the luxurious, dark gold gleaming chocolate boxes on the table. The phone shrieked again like a death warrant, flashing that exact same familiar profile picture. At the last second of the countdown, Elijah gritted his teeth and swiped the answer button hard. He kept the camera angled cautiously just above his forehead, but the screen on the other end was a bottomless, pitch-black void. Just when he thought the connection had dropped, a deep, resonant, chilling laugh exploded through the speaker, pressing right against his eardrum. Even through the screen, the cramped apartment instantly felt different. A visible wave of dark golden magnetism surged through the air. The once gentle sunlight was forcefully warped by a dominant, scorching heat, and the tiny dust particles around them seemed to ignite into weightless embers. It was a warm, inescapable domination, crashing down like a massive ocean wave. It was deeply comforting yet terrifyingly dangerous, wrapping around Elijah with an absolute authority that tolerated no refusal. It made his eyelashes flutter wildly, throwing his breathing completely out of rhythm. The video cut off. A single message remained on the screen. Tomorrow at noon, let's grab lunch. Don't make me come to your house to invite you myself. Memories, sealed away for a year, cracked open in Elijah's mind like amber melting under intense heat. It was a bizarre, neon-drenched night. To pay off his father's gambling debts, Elijah had been dragged along by debt collectors, searching a dimly lit bar for an easy mark to set up. Naively, he chose the man sitting at the counter, sharp suit, expensive watch catching the light. But he never imagined that on his first try, he would pick the city's most untouchable apex predator, Brent. When Elijah rushed out of the hotel bathroom, heart pounding out of his chest, the extortion he anticipated wasn't happening. Instead, his accomplices were kneeling on the messy carpet, shaking like leaves. Brent leaned back lazily against the plush headboard, his legs crossed with effortless elegance. Even the harsh fluorescent lights above seemed intimidated by his presence. The lighting around him naturally softened, dimming into a heavily enveloping warm orange glow. Thick, golden ripples seemed to drift through the air like warm honey you could drown in. It carried an absolute control that made your knees weak, silently washing over Elijah's ankles. "You idiot. Do you know who he is?" The lead thug screamed, shattering the dead silence. Extreme exhaustion from working back-to-back shifts left the corners of Elijah's eyes flushed red. Half closing his eyes against that cocoon-like overpowering magnetism, he muttered in defeat, "Is he broke?" The air stalled for a split second. On the bed, Brent let out a very light, short laugh. With that sound, the dense orange glow around him seemed to come alive, brushing gently yet forcefully against Elijah's tense jawline. Brent looked down at the men on the floor, a smirk playing on his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Get out." The thugs scrambled out of the room. Elijah tried to drag his stiff legs to follow, but a low, scorching whisper slammed into his back. "You stay." The heavy wooden door slammed shut, completely locking Elijah's slender frame into Brent's inescapable, warm, golden domain. 19-year-old Elijah gripped the edge of his faded denim jacket, his knuckles turning white from the force. The heavy carved door blocked out the noise of the world. Brent's deep eyes reflected the room's soft light. He lazily patted the soft mattress beside him. "If you want the money, let's see what you've got." But Elijah's skills that night consisted of hitting the mattress and instantly passing out. When he woke up, his clothes were perfectly intact, and the space beside him was empty. The only things left were a business card and a piping hot gourmet breakfast. In the money-soaked days that followed, the indulgence Brent gave him was like a storm coated in warm sugar icing. Whatever Elijah asked for, he got. That was, until the day Elijah watched Brent calmly adjusting his immaculate cuffs under that warm orange light, while a former associate lay completely shattered and utterly defeated at his feet. Brent didn't even bat an eye. He just turned and took Elijah's hand with his warm palm, leading him out to dinner. Elijah realized that one day, if Brent got tired of him, he could be discarded just as effortlessly. To escape this suffocating warmth, like a frog boiling in a pot of water, Elijah saved up enough money and completely fled the city with his family. A whole year passed without a single word. Elijah thought he had surely been forgotten. The scene snapped back to the present. In the luxurious, dead, silent restaurant hallway, the only sound was the faint echoing of the brothers' footsteps. If I knew, I'd have told Mom to come too. The food here must be amazing." Danny looked around excitedly. "You've been single ever since you broke up last time. Totally unwanted. Good thing my online date is loaded." Elijah's eye twitched, forcing down the surging anxiety in his chest. "Shut up. Who says I'm unwanted? Gino from the fruit stand next door is still chasing me. Where do you think we get all those cherries at home?" Before he could even finish his sentence, the manager respectfully pushed open the heavy doors of the private dining room. The large round table was laden with exquisite dishes, wreathed in rising steam. Brent leaned back lazily against his chair, resting his chin in one hand. His fingertips absently spun a silver dining knife that caught the cold light. The instant their eyes met, a violent shudder ripped down Elijah's spine. Pure instinct kicked in. He gripped Denny's wrist, desperate to bolt, only to find the looming shadows of burly bodyguards at the door had completely sealed off any way out. Elijah spun back around, moving like a rusted machine. He squeezed out a smile that looked worse than a crying face, his Adam's apple bobbing with immense effort. "What a coincidence, Mr. Brent." Brent slowly stood up. The silver knife in his fingers continued to carve cold arcs in the air. As he stepped closer, the bright overhead lights in the room abruptly dimmed. Thick, visible waves of amber dust seemed to materialize out of thin air. This swirling light carried the intoxicating, healing warmth of a winter fireplace, yet it felt like a suffocatingly thick cashmere blanket. It completely engulfed Elijah, wrapping around him so tightly that even the air between them began to warp and tremble under the sheer density of that heat. A towering shadow entirely eclipsed Elijah. Brent lowered his lashes, leaning in with a heavy, inescapable domination until he was mere inches from Elijah's pale cheek. Deep within those bottomless eyes, a contrasting, dangerous glint flickered. The thick, warm orange glow danced between their nearly touching noses, so hot it practically melted Elijah's frantically fluttering eyelashes. Brent's deep voice brushed slowly against his ear through the heat. A year apart, and now it's Mr. Brent. His long fingers paused slightly, his gaze locking dead onto Elijah's slightly parted, trembling lips. Why aren't you calling me? Uncle Brent? Elijah's eyes darted frantically over Brent's broad shoulders, absolutely terrified to meet that abyssal gaze. In his mind, the very last text message he had sent a year ago flashed like a dying strobe light. A fortune teller said our birth charts clash. We aren't a match. Take care, Uncle Brent. You said our charts clashed. Brent's long, sharply defined fingers suddenly clamped onto Elijah's tense jawline, compelling him to turn his face back around. Inside the room, the lighting shifted again. Amber waves, as thick as liquid honey, surged through the air. This extremely warm, profoundly healing halo brought with it an undeniable suffocating magnetism, clinging relentlessly to Elijah's wildly shaking eyelashes. Brent pulled him right up to the marble dining table. Laid out perfectly across the surface were 10 different birth chart cards. The man's dominant frame pressed against him from behind. His scorching breath, carrying that intoxicating warmth, grazed Elijah's flushed ear. I'll give you 10 chances to figure out which chart is mine. Get it wrong once, and we go by the old rules. Along with the whisper, that searingly hot, large hand slid down naturally, gripping his waist in an intimately dangerous squeeze. Elijah squeezed his eyes shut in despair, his fingertips trembling so hard they nearly dug into his palms. Forget birth charts. He didn't even know this man's birthday. Big brother is so young. Elle, why are you calling him uncle? Denny's crisp, childish voice abruptly sliced right through the thick, warm-hued waves. Elijah opened his eyes in utter defeat, shooting frantic warning looks at his brother. However, Brent paused. The tight crease between his brows miraculously smoothed out at the words big brother. The surrounding, oppressive, magma-like heat instantly downgraded into the gentle, flickering glow of embers by a winter fireplace. Hez smarter than his older brother. Brent turned and pulled out a chair, lifting his chin slightly. Sit down. Eat. Catching on to that softening of the light, Elijah immediately straightened his spine, desperate to seize this fleeting chance of survival. My brother is just a kid. He messed around online using my photos. I'm just here today to apologize and pay you back. Before the words even settled, the fireplace-like warmth completely froze. The faint smile on Brent's lips cracked piece by piece. He looked down, the veins bulging on the back of the hand gripping the silver knife. Those were hands stained with dark ruin, hands that had snapped men's bones. Yet, they were the exact same hands that had endlessly stroked Elijah's trembling spine under soft, warm covers, coaxing him to call out his name over and over again. Sit down and eat. Just 4 short words, completely devoid of any room for argument. The agonizingly drawn-out meal was condensed into the suffocating clinking of silverware. Wrapped up in that increasingly dense, warm light, Elijah swallowed down the food like he was sitting on pins and needles. The Maybach glided smoothly into the night. Inside the cabin, Brent scrolled through his phone screen, completely expressionless. So all this time, it hasn't been you messaging me? There was an almost imperceptible trace of disappointment in the man's voice. The warm orange glow of the streetlights washed over his striking profile, painting a streak of lonely warmth inside the confined space. Alarm bells screamed in Elijah's head. He elbowed Denny hard in the ribs, but Denny, completely blind to the room, lowered his voice into a loud whisper. It was me. Elle hasn't dated anyone since his last breakup, but Hez about to. Gino from the fruit shop next door has great eyes and an awesome body. If Gino gets the wrong idea about this, I won't get any more free cherries. Gino? The air inside the car instantly spiked in temperature. This supremely dominant, warm dust pierced straight into Elijah's stomach like needles, triggering a violent physical spasm of pain. Denny's sleepy. Elijah shoved his brother's head hard against his chest, slapping a hand tight over that absolutely unfiltered mouth. He looked up in sheer panic, colliding dead-on with Brent's frigid, blade-like glare in the rearview mirror. Pure instinct made Elijah press his spine flat against the freezing car window, desperately trying to escape this drowning sea of gentle light. They finally reached the alley entrance. Elijah practically tumbled out of the car, dragging his brother along like a man granted a pardon. Cold sweat had completely soaked through the fabric of his shirt. The remaining 30 grand, "I'll pay you back as soon as possible." Brent just stared at him quietly, not uttering a single word. The dark-tinted window rolled up slowly, slicing off that scorching gaze. The very second his nerves slacked, hurried footsteps shattered the quiet night. "Elijah, your mom is in the hospital." Gino came sprinting over, pushing his motorcycle, panic written all over his face. In a few frantic seconds of pure chaos, Gino shoved Denny toward the old lady next door, then pulled Elijah right onto the back of the bike. The moment Elijah sat down, Gino suddenly spun around, jammed a helmet onto Elijah's head, and grabbed Elijah's freezing hands, wrapping them firmly around his own waist. "Hold on tight." But the absolute millisecond his fingertips touched Gino's waist, two blindingly hot, warm gold high beams, burning like miniature suns, suddenly flared from the silent Maybach at the end of the alley. This intensely warm, excruciatingly blinding beam cut through the dark like a sniper's laser locked on its prey. It shot across the void, nailing dead onto the back of Elijah's hand wrapped around Gino, burning so fiercely it made his very soul shudder. Vroom! The motorcycle tore through the quiet of the old street, leaving that terrifyingly warm sea of light far, far behind in the dust. The wind howled. Gino pulled up at a red light, glancing into his rearview mirror with a frown. Weird. Why is that car behind us tailing us? Elijah bit his lower lip hard, his face deathly pale, lacking even the courage to look back. As his vision blurred, deeply buried memories flooded his mind. At that high-end, softly lit dinner party, someone had used liquid courage to touch his hand. By the time the night ended, under the exact same healing, warm orange wall lights, Brent stood there casually smoking. There wasn't a single ripple of emotion in his eyes as he quietly watched that offending hand get utterly ruined by shattered, crystalline glass. In the night breeze, Gino's warm palm covered the back of Elijah's freezing hand. "Hold on tight." Lights green. Before he even finished speaking, the roar of an engine ripped through the street like a wild beast. Elijah's stomach twisted into a violent knot as he watched the black Maybach like a cold, hard streak of dark lightning graze right past them and tear down the road. Is he insane? Who drives like that? Gino cursed under his breath, but Elijah just let out a long, shaky breath, his open palms already slick with cold sweat. The glaring fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway washed every last drop of color from Elijah's pale face. His mother's food stand had been trashed by a gang of thugs, triggering a sudden heart attack that landed her in the ER. Elijah gripped the thick stack of medical bills so tightly, his knuckles turned an unnatural, sickly white. To get the ID needed for her admission, he borrowed Gino's keys and headed down to the dim underground parking garage alone. The second he touched the freezing car door handle, a vicious, tearing pain seized his scalp. Several dark figures aggressively dragged him into a blind corner. A scarred face grabbed his hair, pinning him hard against the rough concrete. "Cameron owes $5 million, principal and interest. Hand it over. Your old man is out there bragging that you're making a killing selling yourself." "I don't know any Cameron." Elijah roared. The corners of his eyes flushed red as he threw a punch with everything he had. His reward was a brutally heavy kick straight to the gut. Elijah curled up on the freezing concrete in agony, wrapping his arms tightly around his head. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing to endure the inevitable onslaught. But the prolonged strike he expected abruptly stopped. The chaotic footsteps retreated like a receding tide, plunging the garage into a dead silence. Hesitantly, Elijah loosened his arms and slowly lifted his head. The once cold, damp, dead corner of the parking garage had been completely swallowed by an overwhelmingly dominant, dark orange glow. Brent stood before him backlit by the glow, imposing as a god. The debt collectors had completely vanished. The surrounding air felt like it had been instantly ignited by a massive spike in temperature. Visible, scorching heat waves violently warped the air, and countless tiny dark red sparks, like the dying embers of a cigarette, floated and drifted within the halo of light. This absolute dominating heat carried a deeply invasive scorch, stinging the corners of Elijah's eyes. Calmly holding a flickering cigarette between his fingers, Brent slowly crouched down. That warped, dark orange wave of heat instantly surged over Elijah's face, burning so intensely that tears of pure physical reaction immediately pooled in his eyes. "You left me, just to end up this pathetic?" In the midst of this suffocating heat wave, one that inexplicably brought a massive sense of security, Elijah's defenses totally collapsed. Coughing and gasping, his face streaked with tears, he abandoned all restraint and buried himself straight into that broad, fiercely glowing chest. Brent's towering frame suddenly stiffened, a violent tremor crossing his bottomless pupils. The dark red embers swirling in the air froze for a split second, then morphed into massive waves of warm golden dust, soft as goose down. Those large hands hesitated mid-air for a few seconds. Finally, with the faintest sigh, they awkwardly yet gently stroked down Elijah's thin, trembling spine over and over. Back in the cramped, suffocating apartment, the cheap fluorescent light buzzed loudly. Right now, this high and mighty apex predator was sitting with his legs wide apart on a battered sofa in a space no bigger than 600 square feet, his brows locked in a deep frown as he surveyed the room. Elijah grabbed his ID and thanked Brent. "Thank you for today." "Thank me? Show it with actions. Don't just use your mouth." There was no such thing as a free lunch. Elijah knew that rule all too well. He clenched his fists, still struggling to say, "I have to get back to the hospital to drop this off." Brent pulled out his phone and made a call. "Come up here and run something to the hospital for me." After his assistant left, a brief silence fell over the room. Elijah was desperate to get back to take care of his mother and didn't want to drag this out with Brent. He clenched his fists so hard, his nails nearly dug into his flesh. "Just tell me straight. How do you want me to thank you?" Brent leaned back lazily. His abyssal gaze swept from top to bottom, scraping across Elijah's tense body with heavy invasion. "Thank me? Show it with actions. Don't just use your mouth." The string of reason in his mind snapped completely. Elijah's whole body went rigid, 2 patches of fiery red burning on his cheeks. Biting his lower lip dead hard, right under Brent's stunned gaze, he reached down with trembling fingertips and yanked off his pants. The air froze solid. A flash of sheer shock broke through the playful mockery in Brent's eyes, his Adam's apple bobbing hard. The scorching light that had just begun to heat up instantly stalled at this absurd sight, then completely deflated, pulling back every ounce of its aggressive edge like a receding tide. He shut his eyes in frustration, letting out a heavy sigh, his sharply defined fingers helplessly massaging his throbbing temples. "What are you doing?" Brent's voice carried an unhidden dry helplessness. "Go make me a bowl of noodles, the kind you used to make me every morning." Elijah stood there blankly, clutching his waistband as a cold draft hit his bare calves. He stared dumbly at the man on the sofa draped in that warm light. The fear in his eyes cracked apart piece by piece, turning into an utterly disbelieving whisper, "Birthday noodles." A cheap porcelain bowl was slid in front of Brent. The rising steam blurred the man's profound features. Elijah crashed right into a pair of eyes surging with dark undercurrents. Inside that cramped apartment, the previously mild orange glow suddenly exploded. It morphed into deeply invasive, dark golden magma, slamming Elijah flat against the back of his chair with overwhelming momentum. Brent's massive frame closed in with terrifying domination. His rough fingertip, radiating scorching heat, hovered just a millimeter away from Elijah's slightly parted lips. The thick, warm light in the air trembled violently, as if it was going to swallow him whole the very next second. However, right at the moment of contact, the man's clenched jawline snapped tight. All that surging, blinding golden light was ripped away instantly, as if doused by ice water. Brent stood up abruptly, his broad back showing absolutely no lingering attachment. "I'm leaving. You don't have to pay me back." The wooden door shut tight, taking the very last trace of warmth from the room with it. The following days flew by. Ever since Brent showed up, the debt collectors had vanished. Elijah knew exactly who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. He sat on a bench in the hospital corridor, spacing out as he thought about the man etched into his heart. Gino sat down next to him, covering the back of Elijah's hand with his own. Pure reflex kicked in. Elijah pulled his hand away. A flash of hurt crossed Gino's eyes, but he quickly forced a smile. "The doctor said your mom can be discharged tomorrow." Elijah stared at his dirty sneakers and said politely, "Thanks for everything lately." Gino stayed quiet for a long time. Finally, as if making up his mind, he suddenly grabbed Elijah's hand. Denny said you got hurt so badly in your last relationship that you've stayed single ever since. Could you give me a chance?" Elijah sighed internally. Denny, that little brat, would spin any rumor just to scam some free food and drinks. Hurt by his last relationship? What a joke. Elijah had always known exactly where he stood. He and Brent were just taking what they needed from each other. How could a transaction like that possibly break my heart? "Gino, you know I've always just seen you as a brother." Gino's eyes went red with grievance as he tried to catch his hand again. "Can't you just give me one chance?" Elijah pulled his fingertips away with zero expression on his face. But the second he looked up, a tall, commanding silhouette flashed past the frosted glass at the end of the hall. With it came a faint, nearly imperceptible trace of warm golden dust, a sight so nostalgic it made his nose sting. Elijah shot to his feet and bolted out the doors like a madman. The freezing wind filled his sleeves. Outside, there was nothing but an empty street and an endless, biting cold. Just as Elijah finally steadied his breathing and turned to head back inside, his phone rang. It was Denny. "I'm with Dad right now." Over the phone, Denny's sobbing voice pierced like an ice pick. Smash! The second Elijah rushed through the front door, a beer bottle reeking of cheap alcohol flew right past his ear and shattered against the wall. Flying glass shards slashed a glaring crimson mark across his pale cheek. Reeking of liquor, Cameron slouched on the sofa and viciously kicked Denny to the floor. Trembling all over, Elijah clamped his jaw shut tight. He scooped up his curled-up brother, dragged him into the bedroom, and locked the door behind them. His fingers gripping the doorknob turned a dead, sickly white from the sheer tension. "Why the hell did you run away back then?" Cameron staggered closer, his face contorted like a vicious demon. "If you hadn't run, you would've hit the jackpot when Brent died. He put your name down as the beneficiary for all his life insurance. That's why I teamed up with his rivals to run him over." Boom! Those words hit like a thunderstrike, instantly draining every ounce of oxygen from Elijah's lungs. The freezing, run-down surroundings were forcefully muted in that moment. Elijah's pupils trembled violently as an uncontrollable flashback seized his mind, sunlight spilling over a hospital bed like crushed gold, and Brent, eyes closed, letting out a helpless, quiet scoff at Elijah's joking request, "Make me your beneficiary." So, that terrifying apex predator, the man who always wrapped him tightly in an intensely dominant, scorching warm light, had silently paved a golden escape route for him in the most dangerous darkness, trading his own survival to do it. Thud. Cameron grabbed Elijah by the hair and slammed his head brutally against the hard table. Agonizing pain and severe dizziness crashed over him as a torrential downpour of punches and kicks rained onto his back. "Since you're utterly useless, at least Denny has some value. A kid can still fetch a decent price." The demon's whispers exploded by his ear. In a state of absolute despair and fury, Elijah's hand found the cold fruit knife at the edge of the table. Slash. The blade sank precisely and ruthlessly into flesh. Cameron's arrogant sneer froze instantly. Elijah collapsed into the mess on the floor. He gasped heavily for air, strictly guarding that thin wooden door behind him amidst the sickening, metallic scent and macabre silence. The crisp click of the front door unlocking cracked like thunder, making Elijah shoot to his feet in terror. His crimson-stained hands instinctively hid the hilt of the knife dead behind his back. But the moment he recognized the man walking in, his bowstring-tight spine completely gave out. Brent stood in the entryway, carrying the freezing draft from outside, his chest heaving. His profound gaze quickly swept over Cameron lying on the floor. He immediately deadbolted the door and calmly made a phone call. Within minutes, a handful of men in black poured in silently. They dragged Cameron away and used pungent bleach to entirely erase the dark red stains from the floor. Amidst the chaotic blur, Brent took a massive stride over to a shell-shocked Elijah and pressed him down into the soft sofa. He took a pure white towel from a subordinate, dropped to one knee, and completely wrapped up Elijah's freezing hands. As Brent closed in, that cold metallic scent in the air seemed to incinerate in a flash. Massive, visible waves of warm halos, moving like liquid gold, surged out of nowhere inside the cramped living room. This glow flowed down along Brent's lowered brow, carrying an irresistible healing magnetism that slowly licked across Elijah's trembling fingertips. I took a life. Elijah's pupils were unfocused, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. No, you didn't, Brent replied in a low voice, meticulously wiping away the dark mess between his fingers. Cameron is dead. Has not. Has still breathing. Should I turn myself in? Am I going to prison? What about Mom's medical bills? Denny needs to go to school. Fear broke the dam. Elijah was breaking down, rambling incoherently, until a broad, scorching hot chest suddenly crashed into him, pulling him intensely and tightly into an embrace. Brent let out a heavy sigh. The warm, liquid golden light around them suddenly skyrocketed. It morphed into a massive, heavy, yet incredibly soft net, wrapping Elijah seamlessly from head to toe, completely sealing off the freezing cold and despair of the outside world. "I'm here. Nothing is going to happen." The deep voice pressed right against his eardrum, dropping a promise that carried the weight of a mountain. The room's furniture had been restored to exactly how it was, so clean that it looked as if the nightmare had never even happened. Still trembling from the aftershocks, Elijah pushed open the bedroom door. He scooped Denny, who was curled up deep in the closet like a terrified little animal, and carried him back to bed. As he pulled the blanket over him, a half-lit phone screen caught his eye. It was a chat thread between Denny and Brent. Denny was the one who had tipped Brent off. The profile picture was a photo of Elijah. Scrolling up, Elijah saw their chat history. The two of them gamed together all the time. Denny, riding high on his gaming skills, would always mock Brent after a match, and Brent always replied with an almost indulging, gentle warmth. Elijah's eyes burned. He collapsed helplessly onto the edge of the bed. His Adam's apple bobbed with immense difficulty as scalding tears crashed onto the back of his hands. Stepping out of the bedroom, he ran right into Brent, who was just coming in from the balcony after a call. Elijah hurriedly turned his face away, wiping the wetness from the corners of his eyes with the back of his hand in a panic. Brent stopped in his tracks, his towering shadow instantly looming over him. "Where are you? Sleeping tonight?" "The couch." "And what about me?" Elijah looked up in pure confusion, only to crash completely defenseless into a pair of dark eyes surging with intense possessiveness. His heart violently skipped a beat. "You. Go home to sleep." Elijah turned sideways to dodge, but his wrist was clamped tight in a vice grip. The world spun, and his back slammed heavily against the freezing front door. "Elle, are my feelings really that easy to play with?" Brent's arm caged him against the door, his breathing heavy and rough. A dense, stabbing pain flared in his chest. Elijah bit his pale lip raw. "I didn't play you. I was completely clean before I met you. And after we split, I tried to forget you, but I just couldn't do it." "Then why did you run?" The stunned look in the man's eyes the first time they met at the bar intertwined with the grating whispers of others calling him a young toy. Elijah's voice finally cracked with an undeniable sob. "The only reason you wanted me was because of my face, wasn't it? When I get older, you'll naturally swap me out for someone younger." The boiling sea of dark orange fire in the air abruptly stalled at that choked-out confession. Brent pinched the bridge of his nose hard, a flash of profound helplessness crossing his abyssal eyes. He let out a heavy sigh. His hands grabbed Elijah's slender shoulders in a punishing, tight grip, forcing those tear-reddened eyes to look directly at him. Who exactly was worried about being swapped out? The man's voice carried a hint of gritted teeth vulnerability. The intense firelight surrounding them slowly shed its aggression, shifting into layers of dim yet thick, warm embers that completely entangled the two of them together. "Do you know how conflicted I was when I sent you to college? I went to pick you up, and I watched you laughing on the field with your arms around your classmates. I listened to them asking if I was your uncle." Brent lowered his head, pressing his scorching forehead against Elijah's, his eyes surging with self-deprecation and madness. "I was so jealous I was losing my mind, Elle. I always thought that as long as I had enough money, I could keep you by my side." Inside the cramped living room, Brent's voice was incredibly hoarse. This man, who had always been as dominant and commanding as a tyrant, had actually lowered his proud head. With his whispers, the surrounding, Highly inescapable waves of dark gold light seemed to drop all their defenses. They shattered and softened inch by inch, finally fading into the mildest, most harmless dark orange glow of a winter fireplace, clinging carefully, almost coaxingly, to Elijah's ankles. Until I woke up from that car crash and found out you were gone. I went and learned that game you love so much, and it turns out, a flash of undisguised vulnerability crossed Brent's profound eyes. He slowly reached out and pulled Elijah fiercely into his arms, burying his burning forehead heavy against the younger man's thin shoulder. I'm already not young anymore. I'm going to get old long before you do. How could I ever get tired of you? That almost pleading confession completely shattered the very last of Elijah's defenses. His arms trembling, he fiercely hugged that broad back in return, letting his tears fall silently into the scorching hot crook of the man's neck. That night, Brent stubbornly refused to leave the cramped apartment. On the simple floor pallet, their bodies pressed seamlessly together in the pitch black. An amber halo, thick as honey, flowed through the air. The room's temperature climbed steadily with every touch of skin. Brent wrapped his arms tightly around Elijah's waist from behind with an unyielding, inescapable hold. It felt as though if he loosened his grip by even a single millimeter, the person in his arms would vanish into thin air all over again. To soothe the deep-seated insecurity radiating from the man's very bones, Elijah managed to turn around. He buried his cheek into the scorching crook of Brent's neck. His soft lips trailed up the man's jawline, inch by inch. In the dark, Brent's eyes were startlingly bright. His previously restrained breathing instantly turned heavy. The mild orange glow surrounding them flared like a furnace injected with pure oxygen, abruptly erupting into a deep crimson aura of absolute craving. Just as Elijah tried to pull back for air, Brent's large hand firmly cupped the back of his head. He leaned down, capturing his lips with overwhelming, undeniable intensity. A year of suppression, madness, and longing all detonated in this inescapable, all-consuming kiss. In the cramped space, the thick, scorching heat threatened to melt them both. Fine beads of sweat gathered on Brent's temples. Finally, with a husky exhale, he scooped up the young man, who had completely melted into a puddle in his arms, and took long strides toward the bathroom, already filled with swirling steam and warm light. The biting pre-dawn wind sliced through the silence. The horizon glowed with a cold ashen blue. Elijah pulled his collar tight, his face pale but unusually calm as he walked toward the police station. In his mind, the scenario he had rehearsed countless times, taking the fall alone to buy his mother and brother a lifetime of peace, fast-forwarded rapidly in the chilling wind. As long as Cameron was gone, everything would return to normal. Just as the streetlights at the corner were about to flicker out, a scorching large hand gripped Elijah's freezing wrist with absolute, irresistible domination. Elijah. Elijah whipped his head around, his pupils shrinking drastically. Brent stood breathless in the freezing wind, his chest heaving heavily. His messy black hair was soaked with cold sweat. The buttons of his expensive shirt were completely misaligned, and he was standing barefoot on the freezing asphalt. Those eyes, usually so unfathomable, were now rimmed with frantic red. He held on to Elijah with desperate magnetism, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Where are you going?" "I took a life. I can't drag you down with me." The corners of Elijah's eyes instantly went red. "No matter how much power you have, if you help me, it'll just give them something to use against you." Brent stared him down, his brow twitching hard. Hearing those words, his extreme panic morphed into a dark, exasperated scoff of sheer disbelief. "You are going to be the death of me." Brent yanked Elijah back into his arms. His large hand delivered a punishing, heavy smack to the young man's backside. Hez not dead. They saved him. Hez tied to several home invasions. Hez going to spend the rest of his life locked behind bars. Elijah froze completely. "Not dead? Stop making decisions for me." Brent cupped Elijah's tear-stained face. The previously chaotic, raging golden light began to settle inch by inch. It morphed into a dazzling cocoon of light, warmer and more forgiving than the morning sun, wrapping them tightly together. "Such a small guy. How do you have so many big ideas?" The man's scorching lips pressed against the corner of Elijah's eye, kissing away those bitter tears one by one. His deep voice softened incredibly in the morning breeze. Be good. Don't ever run away from me again. Elijah bit his lower lip hard, but he still couldn't suppress the sobs rising in his throat. Brent sighed helplessly, his broad hand stroking down the younger man's spine over and over. Under the man's bewildered gaze, Elijah managed to step half a pace back. He silently slipped off his sneakers and pushed them in front of those freezing, reddened bare feet. Wear these. Brent looked down at the slightly too small sneakers on the ground and let out a breathless laugh. He obediently stepped into the shoes, then turned around, dropping steadily to one knee, right in front of Elijah. The first true ray of dawn tore through the clouds, blending flawlessly with the intensely healing, warm, golden light radiating around Brent. Get on. The man's voice carried an undeniable, indulgent warmth. Hurry up. His ears burning red, Elijah obediently climbed onto that broad, scorching back. Brent hoisted him up effortlessly, walking steadily toward home in a world bathed in golden morning light. If anyone found out that I was chasing someone barefoot down the street in the freezing dawn, looking like a total mess, Brent felt the weight on his back, a deep chuckle vibrating in his chest. That would be the biggest thing anyone could ever hold against me. Elijah buried his face deep into the crook of the man's neck, soaking up that familiar, intoxicatingly warm presence you could just drown in. I'm sorry. I'll deal with you when we get home.
And that is where our story ends. Before Elijah met Brent, his life was like a damp, freezing sewer, constantly shrouded in a suffocating gloom. He thought that as long as he took his mother and brother far away from that monster, they would finally live in peace. But fate wasn't nearly as kind as he had hoped. After all, bottom feeders like Cameron, people who lived in the gutter, would drain every last drop of value from anyone around them. He was an inescapable nightmare, a parasite who would always track Elijah down to shatter his fragile peace. That is, until he met Brent. Elijah's hopelessly gray world was forcefully pulled into a warm, golden storm called destiny. Brent was a man of extreme contradictions. He was obsessive, fiercely dominant, and possessed an intense, overwhelming magnetism. He would use absolute control to keep Elijah by his side, even stooping to learn a video game he normally wouldn't spare a second glance. Yet, his devotion was incredibly pure. Pure enough to quietly put Elijah's name on a life insurance policy. Pure enough to lay down his own life just to pave a golden escape route for him. He never explained himself. He just stood silently in that blinding, dazzling light, holding up an untouchable sanctuary for Elijah where no storm could ever reach him. Now, Elijah never has to be afraid again. His once dark life has finally welcomed the warm, radiant sunlight, and this time, standing right beside him, is his most unbreakable anchor. Which part of this story was your favorite? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. See you next time.